An alcoholic with a DUI, a crisis of faith, multiple engagements, a military discharge, and the 43rd President of the United States. George W. Bush had the opportunity to be what 42 others had tried to be for Americans, a role model. Yet he stands as one of the most controversial figures to sit in the Oval Office. His tenure in office smeared with controversy, and his Republican ideals contradicting his past.
Clearly, putting a mission accomplished on an aircraft carrier was a mistake. It sent the wrong message.
Since the birth of the United States, politics of the nation have been a grueling game that have left the American people divided between parties and conflicted about the government. Few presidents embodied this aspect of controversy more than George Walker Bush. I'm Scott Currier, and for the duration of this broadcast, we are going to examine the life of George W. Bush and the effects he's had on the world. Born in 1946, George Walker Bush is the son of George Herbert Walker Bush, who later became the 41st President of the United States, and the eldest of 4 siblings. George was educated in Midland, Texas, before his family moved to Houston, where he began to attend the Kincaid Prep School for 2 years. He started high school at the Phillips Academy boarding school in Massachusetts, even taking part in activities such as baseball and being crowned head cheerleader. After graduation, he attended Yale, where George continued his pursuit of sports by playing rugby, and again finding himself as a cheerleader. He also began to acquire leadership skills at Yale, such as being the president of the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity. He graduated Yale with a 77 GPA, moving on to Harvard Business School to earn his MBA. He is the only president to have earned his MBA.
Now, George Bush was not a typical student that you would think of when you think of a president in college. He's been quoted saying that he's more known for his personality rather than his education. At that point, he was really the president of his frat house, not a school club or diplomacy-based anything.
After his college years were behind him, George was engaged twice and converted religions before finally settling down. However, Bush still behaved as an adolescent, as he became a hardened alcoholic, earning himself a DUI in 1976, and other reported abuses of alcohol were recorded in his life before and after this event. Despite this fact, George was commissioned into the Texas Air National Guard from 1968 to 1974. During this time, George was given a position as a pilot, even though his attendance was low and his pilot aptitude tests did not meet the requirements. Allegations of favoritism in the school were supported by George H.W. Bush, currently standing as a major political figure in the House of Representatives, as his son was promoted without meeting these requirements. This promotion without prerequisite led to a feeling of entitlement for George, and he refused a physical examination in 1972. This consequently left George Bush sitting out of flying until he was deemed fit to return to duty. He was discharged 2 years later in 1974, and 3 years later, Bush took his first steps into business with the founding of Arbusto Energy.
So, Arbusto Energy was basically Bush's attempt at getting into the oil industry. However, he wasn't able to get the proper funding in order to make his business a reality. Therefore, he renamed it the Bush Exploration. Therefore, he could get his father's namesake to maybe boost some publicity and actually get some customers. That still didn't help. Oil prices had fallen dramatically, and they then became HKN Incorporated. However, Bush then decided he wanted to leave the business industry, so he traded away all his stock with HKN, and how that led to him being investigated by the SEC for an insider trading scandal. And evidence was found against him, but not enough to charge him for insider trading.
This incident was enough to finally move Bush on from business and pursue a political career. Bush's family moved to Washington, D.C. in 1988 to work on George H.W. Bush's presidential campaign. While on the campaign staff, George W. Bush traveled with his father as his campaign manager and media liaison. During this time, he gained skills he would later use during his own presidency.
His father asked him to be a part of his campaign, as a media liaison and really the campaign manager that would handle all of his PR. And I think that goes back to sort of his time as a cheerleader, where he would go up and he would get these crowds all excited and get them to believe in someone. And I think that was a big part of what he did and why his father got elected.
Eventually, though, the young Bush finally made a successful jump into politics in the role of governor of Texas.
So Bush finally entered politics in 1995 as the governor of Texas. His campaign, he focused on 4 different things. He wanted welfare reform, tort reform, crime reduction, and education improvement. And during it, he promised to sign a bill to allow concealed firearm permits to Texans. When he was elected as governor, Texas prospered under him, and it turned Texas into a leader of alternative energy at a time where Republicans were very, very into that. He cut taxes and used the surplus money to form new education programs and combat drug abuse.
In 1999, Bush began his presidential campaign. However, it wasn't without its challenges, as George H.W. Bush left a bad taste in the American people's mouths, especially after the tax hikes.
Bush Sr.'s, basically his whole presidential campaign was, read my lips, no taxes, no raising taxes. What does he do? He raises taxes. This basically completely weighed down his son and his endeavors.
After a series of closely fought primaries, however, Bush had secured the Republican nomination by a slim margin. However, the real challenge would be Democratic nominee Al Gore.
During Bush's campaign for president, he was running as a sort of compassionate conservative kind of guy, where he wanted to use the same strategies he did in Texas, which was cutting taxes and using the surplus funds to fund internal improvements like the education system, and do that on a national scale, which made him very popular with a lot of people. The only problem with that was Al Gore. Al Gore was his Democratic opponent, and a lot of people liked Al Gore, and this led to a very close race right at the very end.
After numerous recounts, each tallying different results, the Supreme Court stepped in and partisanly selected Bush 5-4 to be the next president, halting the recounts. George W. Bush had become the first son of a president since John Quincy Adams to become a president himself. Bush signed many conservative acts during his first few months in office, such as funding cuts for programs to offer abortions, halting any and all stem cell research, and cutting taxes for the wealthy, basing this off the system of trickle-down economics. However, Bush was about to face the greatest challenge of his presidency, not 1 year into his term.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, hello, Barney.
Hello. Hello.
Hello?
Hello.
Bonjour.
Hi.
How you doing there? Yellow. Hello.
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 Hello?
Hello?
Yo, yo.
Hello. Hello.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
In 2001, America was changed forever. Not 1 year into the newly elected president's term, George W. Bush was about to face the single greatest challenge of his presidency. September 11th, 2001. America was changed forever by a series of attacks on American soil. As a response to these attacks, George Bush signed into effect Operation Enduring Freedom, where the Bush administration announced the immediate beginning of airstrikes in the Middle East and beginning what we now know as the War on Terror. President Bush also enacted the Patriot Acts, which tightened security in the wake of the devastating attack on the United States. These acts gave the government free rein to investigate anyone who was suspicious and indefinitely detain them, including U.S. citizens. This law was a major violation of many of the rights guaranteed to U.S. citizens, and ethically wrong to those from the countries of interest that Bush feared housed more terrorist organizations. These acts were in response to the escalating tensions and continued acts of aggression, such as the anthrax scare of October 2001. During this attack, the entire U.S. Capitol shut down during an outbreak of a deadly bacteria. Following this, Bush committed $1.5 million to combat bioterrorism.
In just a week's time, we have had 4 confirmed cases of anthrax, all with media connections, and a number of anthrax scares as well.
ABC News.
In Nevada,
in New Jersey tonight,
the U.S. House of Representatives is closing offices today until Tuesday to allow a complete sweep for traces of anthrax.
The anthrax scare was it was a bioterrorism attack. The Beltway sniper attacks were there were multiple shootings from 2 Muslim men who would stay on top of rooftops of highly public places, and they would shoot sniper rifles at passing people. Fortunately, they were caught, and one of them was sentenced to death, while the other one was facing multiple life imprisonments with no possible parole.
In the wake of 9/11, a lot of Muslims were discriminated against and mistreated and just purely hated for no real good reason, as most Muslims were non-violent, and it wasn't their fault that this attack had happened. But regardless, the United States populace still attacked them, and they were forced to live in ghetto neighborhoods. And amidst of all this fear and controversy, American people looked to their president for guidance, and that cheerleader who got himself into office saw the enemy, saw the opposing team, and rallied anyone he could against that team. And that's what started the whole war in Iraq.
He also implored action overseas, citing Saddam Hussein as a serious threat to national security before Congress. Calling action in Iraq inevitable, Congress authorized the use of military force on Iraq a month later, on October 10, 2002. Bush also went before the UN and spoke against Iraq again. The Security Council found that Iraq was in violation of a Security Council resolution, which consequently forced the UN to send inspectors to Iraq. Bush then cut taxes to prepare the economy for the coming war he wished to initiate with Iraq. The tax cuts were called hugely irresponsible and harmful to the nation, where they were primarily benefiting the rich. The motion was later denied by Congress. After 3 months of deliberation with the UN, George W. Bush informed the American people that, with a heavy heart, the United States and her allies were now at war with Iraq on March 19, 2003. In May of that same year, Bush proclaims that all major combat operations in Iraq are over, supposedly ending the war on terror and the Iraq War. The speech was given on the aircraft carrier the USS Abraham Lincoln, with an accompanying banner reading, "Mission Accomplished." However, opposite to Bush's claims, guerrilla warfare in Iraq increased casualties to both civilian and military personnel directly following the speech.
When Americans woke up on September the 11th, we did not know that the world would forever change that day. I was sitting in a classroom in Florida, listening to a child read. My chief of staff, South Carolina graduate Andy Card, whispered in my ear, "A second plane has hit the second tower. America is under attack." My first reaction is, that's hot. We're going to deal with these people. On the way to Air Force One from that school, Condi called me and said a plane has hit the Pentagon. I felt the first one was an accident, the second was an attack, and the third one was a declaration of war. I became something that no president should ever want to be, a wartime president.
The Iraqi War was an engineered war. It was mostly like Teddy Roosevelt and how he made the Spanish-American War. What Bush did was, during his mission accomplished speech, he tried to manipulate public spirits with it. He was saying that all military combat campaigns were over. However, it was far from it, actually. The military campaign still existed, and the speech was a blatant lie, or he lied to the American people.
After the coalition assumed control of Iraq, the UN lifted sanctions on Iraq, allowing the United States and Great Britain to oversee the area as they saw fit. The US took control over the oil business in Iraq, profiting off of it. However, the US economy was still suffering since Bush's latest tax cut, and the administration began to worry. He signs the third greatest tax cut in history, aimed primarily at the upper classes of the population. Bush was also back in the spotlight with his own government. The Justice Department announced a full criminal investigation into allegations that administration officials had leaked the name of a covert CIA operative to the media in July of 2003.
Well, it was colossally stupid, of course. What an error of huge proportions with tremendous consequences. But
another strong blow to his approval is taken when the search for nuclear arms in Iraq comes back negative. Iraq was not in possession of nuclear arms.
After the report came in that Iraq was not in possession of WMDs but only had the potential to create them, Americans were outraged at the president, the man who told them that the entire enemy and their huge risk to United States security was in Iraq. They had to go there, they had to protect themselves by fighting them. And they found out about this real lie, and it did not go well for Bush, and the American people were just pure anger.
Bush attempts to spin this report as saying they did have the potential to do it, and thus the search was justified, as they still posed a significant risk to the United States. Attempting to regain popular support, Bush overhauls Medicare and adds conservative ideology in with it, declaring any late-term abortions illegal. Then, on April 28, 2004, one of the first pieces of evidence of U.S. prisoner abuse emerges, as photographs are leaked to CBS depicting Iraqi prisoner abuse by the U.S. Army. Shortly after, internal documents are leaked describing to military officers how to abuse prisoners while staying within the bounds of the law. All this occurred at the end of Bush's first term, where his approval rating had fallen to an all-time low by this point. Bush also disagreed with Massachusetts becoming the first state to legally recognize homosexual marriage, and even proposed an amendment to Congress that would ban such marriages in all states, once again showing his deeply conservative nature. Near the end of the first term, however, Bush also formally ended the occupation of Iraq. Surprisingly, however, despite his low approval rating, George Bush was able to win the election for a second term against Democratic candidate John Kerry. However, Bush would be forced to deal with an old enemy very early into his second term.
And now a message from the former President of the United States.
Good evening. Thank you. It is I, George W. Bush, and you might remember the W stands for what's up. I know what you're thinking. What the heck is this handsome devil doing back in the Oval Office? Well, the truth is, this is just a set. I had it built in my basement in Texas so I could pretend to still be president sometimes.
In the wake of an overseas war, George W. Bush worked to secure the presidency for a second term in office, campaigning against John Kerry, a Democrat from Massachusetts. The pair engaged in 3 debates, with polls showing a close presidential race between the incumbent and his opponent. Bush won the election by a slim margin, however will be faced with an old enemy, as Osama bin Laden began to enter the world stage once again.
During this point, Osama bin Laden officially enters the U.S.'s radar again. Bin Laden clips are aired and address the U.S. population directly, where he claims responsibility for the terrorist attacks and explains his reasoning, while also condemning Bush's responses to these attacks. Many Americans view these clips as attempts by al-Qaeda to influence the 2004 election, but despite of their beliefs, Bush was reelected. Bush then orders the reclaiming of Fallujah in the biggest military strike since the beginning of the war in Iraq. The war is practically over at this point, and the new Iraqi government announces that Saddam is to face trial for war crimes, and the death penalty will be pursued. And in 2006, Saddam is hanged for war crimes dating back to 1982.
With Iraq rebuilding itself, Bush dedicated his second term to working on domestic policies and the U.S.'s relationship with its allies. His first few months were filled with diplomatic visits to Europe to soothe relationships with Germany and Russia after spearheading the invasion of Iraq. Moving on from Europe, he attempted to negotiate with North Korea, as the country had previously announced its intentions to develop nuclear weapons. He worked closely with South Korea's president to reason with North Korea on this matter. However, this matter is never resolved, and North Korea is now a nuclear power in present day. But, as Bush focuses on other nations, he and his administration failed to supply aid to their own nation as Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast. The Category 5 storm left 80% of New Orleans submerged underwater and an estimated $81 billion in property damage.
President Bush knew about Katrina, he'd heard about Katrina, and was actually warned that Hurricane Katrina could submerge the entire city of New Orleans by bypassing the whole levee system. But regardless of this fact, he did nothing. He was actually flying over New Orleans, seeing the wreckage and saying it looked like a huge mess, and then continued moving, even though he had full opportunity to order people to help. And he did order people to help, but it was too little too late.
His approval rating dropped even further. Bush continued sending troops to combat al-Qaeda in Somalia and reinforced the troops still stationed in Iraq. After 4 months of this continued occupation, Congress attempted to pass a bill that would set a timetable for extraction of U.S. forces from Iraq. Vehemently, Bush vetoes this bill and soon after reaches a record low approval rating. Bush also had another problem. The United States faced an economic crash as the housing crisis rocks the nation and the national oil prices began to rise. Bush proposed a stimulus package to force money into the American population. Congress, recognizing the peril the nation was in, permitted him to enact it, allowing the package.
He drops federal interest rates to zero, and then he has to bail out General Motors and Chrysler.
Bush is again slammed with yet another scandal. The Senate Select Committee of Intelligence conducted a thorough investigation into President Bush and found that he and his administration had greatly exaggerated the claims of Saddam Hussein possessing weapons of mass destruction, revealing that the Iraq War was started on a fabrication. The final nail in Bush's coffin was the realization by the American people that the United States had severely crippled Iraq. This epiphany came as the United States Army released a report that stated the U.S. possessed the power to remove Saddam from power, but they had caused irreparable damages to the nation and could not rebuild it into a functioning nation. He was also criticized by the entertainment industry, with music pieces such as American Idiot being released.
Oh yeah, SNL completely destroyed Bush. Well, they destroy every president, but Bush in particular took a huge beating.
In music alone, there was songs like American Idiot, Mosh by Eminem, and Rolling Stone released a cover that dubbed him the worst president ever. And a lot of movies were made about this too. Neil Young's Let's Impeach the President accused him, well, another movie actually accused him of doing this, but it was Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 that accused him of being in business with the Saudis for oil. And after that whole mess with Hurricane Katrina, he was kind of publicly ridiculed by a mashup video that was named George Bush Doesn't Care About Black People. And even after these events, you have to deal with something they didn't have to deal with before, which was the availability of all this. That gave places like The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, and Bill Maher would just throw everything they could at George Bush after all he'd been through and just shoot him out of the White House on his last term.
In 2009, Bush finally left the White House, with the American people eagerly replacing him for the newly elected Democratic candidate, Barack Obama, shuffling up the formerly conservative White House.
On his way out of the White House, Bush left behind a trail of destruction and a nation ruined in his wake.
By the end of his second term, Bush was hated by most everyone in America. This pom-pom waving Texan had just kind of destroyed their nation.
Bush became involved in a country in a war he didn't need to be in and left the nation he vowed to protect in shambles economically and try and pull itself together after a hurricane tore it apart. Everything that could have gone wrong for Bush, in a sense, did, but only because he couldn't fix it and he handled it poorly.
In the end, Bush left office with the lowest approval rating in U.S. history and is one of the most controversial figures to sit in the office. However, his approval rating has risen over the recent years after his departure from the office, though his reputation to many is still stained with the blood of Iraq. I'm Scott Currier, thank you for watching, and have a good evening. Alright, we're done. Wrap it up.
I failed miserably, but I've become Batman.
Why are you here?